Welcome back. This time I wanted to react to two articles, one by Jason Furman in Foreign Affairs, and another one by the Ludwig Institute in Politico. Yet, it's necessary, I believe, to make a preamble with two updates, actually three updates about the Democratic Party, Ukraine, and Palestine. So let's start with the Democratic Party. As you know, a few days ago, Ken Martin was elected the new DNC chair, who is expected to give us the strategy to beat Republicans precisely when Republicans, as uh, you know, because that's what exactly what Trump did in his first administration. He's just doing that more forcefully this time. He's ramming all kinds of executive decisions while Democrats look hapless. You must remember that in my video about clueless Democrats, I mentioned Ruben Gallego giving his vote cheapishly, the same as Fetterman, to a Republican bill that partially suppresses the right to due process by undocumented immigrants, because it's true that probably most of them were criminals and deservedly expelled from this country, but not everybody. Many were what is called collaterals and others. And the fact that Gallego gave cheapishly without demanding any concession is very telling about the attitude of many Democrats. Because one thing is being pragmatic and another thing is caving. Or take into account Jeffries, leader Joaquin Jeffries, hapless claim that they have no leverage over Republicans. Yes, in terms of turning bills into law, you only have the filibuster in the Senate, but you still have something very big, huge to correct, as we have seen in that video about clueless Democrats, which is not just the messaging, it's not just your sales pitch, it's your product itself. On that, you have shown no intention of taking the advice of precisely the president who was elected 4 times, FDR. If you are grown, admit it frankly, and then try something else. And you have not admitted frankly, despite the colossal failure of Kamala Harris in November, you have admitted nothing wrong so far. And then you have the election of Ken Martin as replacement of Jamie Harrison, who who is taken as the DNC doubling down on the identity politics, even though Ken Martin kept repeating the working class as if he were invoking Candyman. It's not enough with repeating the word. You have to propose something of their interest. You have to gain their trust. Actually, you have to gain their trust first, because otherwise you have no credibility. And lastly, on this point, I see lots of people who say idiotically, oh, Trump loves to be admire. He loves to be popular. He is a naughty boy. Please, please, uh, get back to Earth. The best portrait of Trump has been made by David K. Johnston. So yes, he wants the support of his base, not of everybody who has supported for him. And he wants the support of his base because otherwise the establishment of the Republican Party would eat him alive. And impunity is something he needs, and impunity comes through that base. So he is not going to betray that base. Again, get back to his first administration. He made promises about current interest, about enhancing the safety network, and he didn't provide on any of that. But when he suggested that he would support the Dream Act, his base rose in fury and he backpedaled meekly. So he knows uh, what kind of promises he has to provide and which are negligible. Negligible. So now I would like to make a quick update about Ukraine. It doesn't look good. It seems Zelensky himself, desperate, is trying to not lose Trump, and he has even pledged Ukraine natural resources, basically minerals and rare earth, but will Trump be seduced by that? Mm, my inclination is that probably not. Uh, Trump has shown preference for Putin since 2022. Uh, and the fact that Trump has echoed Russian calls for elections in Ukraine precisely when his administration is pushing Zelensky to extend the conscription to 18 years old without the supplies that would have allowed to protect those green soldiers, to mix them with more season which would allow to rotate more seasoned soldiers and integrate those more seasoned soldiers with the green soldiers to avoid what happened to the 155 and 157 brigades. Um, is not doesn't look good because that would if Zelensky capes to extending the conscription that he has to, but not in those conditions. But if he capes, that will make him very unpopular and maybe end up in the elections Trump is calling for in the installing of another Yanukovych. Wouldn't it be very sad, ironic and weird that after 3 years of war, we end up with another Yanukovych? Just in case, let me remind you, Yanukovych was the kleptocrat who was a Putin's puppet, the same way as the Lukashenko is Putin's puppet in Belarus, and who was dethroned by the Ukrainian people, and who is now living in Moscow. And it would not be ironic that we end up returning the reserves to Russia or even to this new Yanukovych, who in turn would return them to Russia. The recent declarations of Trump's defense secretary Hexted are only adding to the sensation that Ukraine is going to be betrayed. So these declarations about no NATO membership, being realistic about territorial concessions, what's the point of helping Ukraine if you are going to let Putin win, if you are going to let him be elevated to Xi Jinping senior partner? That defeats the purpose. Even the RUSA Institute, that is this a very prestigious institute, in which now nothing else that Jack Watling worked, have published articles about in this sense that the is Trump's betraying Zelensky is a very likely outcome. So what to do if you cannot trust Trump? Europe must stand up and prevent a Putin victory that would turn him into Xi's senior partner. Because this victory would enhance, not inhibit, but enhance the arms race pushed by Russia and take us closer to the nightmare scenario, which is a war against both Russia and China. So your goal has to be to get an understanding with China and turn Putin into Kim Jong-un. In that sense, Trump's policy is as bad as or worse than Biden. The hope is that Merz and Starmer and Macron and Tusk can lead Europe in the right direction as soon as Merz wins over Scholz, as I expect in the Germany's February 23 election. And what can Democrats do? They have to repudiate Biden and his salami strategy, this stupidity that was welcomed and implemented by Jake Sullivan, because otherwise they have no credibility. If you have made such a screw up and you don't admit and you don't make a mea culpa, you have no credibility. Now, my uh, update on Palestine is going to be, unfortunately, equally bad. And I start with a question. How good is a ceasefire if the other party is going to ethnic cleanse you? So what is going to be left for you if if the ceasefire ends up with you being kicked out of the country? For To answer this, obviously, I am rhetorical answer, because the evident answer is how good is good for nothing. But it starts with Biden's ceasefire. You must remember, if you follow me on Twitter, that long ago I called this at least naive, at least since October 30 of 2023, and his ceasefires as photo of Lebanon and this one in Israel, in Palestine. Taking into account this, if the resettlement is aimed at protecting USA's of Trump's investments in the Gaza coast to turn it into a Riviera, the resettlement has to be permanent. Since the very beginning, I said that you could not expect stability from a ceasefire that is that is the result of the two parties that are more interested in killing it. Hamas, because Hamas thrives when their narrative is appealing, and over 47,000 dead in Gaza makes it very appealing. And of course, Netanyahu, especially his coalition, when there is chaos and fear in the Israeli people. Now, if the just think of this. If the resettlement is going to give at least the gas and coast to the USA investor or Trump's investments, it has to be permanent. Otherwise, can you imagine these people who has suffered so much since October 7th, the Palestinians, I mean, wanting revenge, just take into account that Hamas has replenished all the ranks that has been killed. All those bad guys who were killed by the IDF, well, yeah, the numbers are bad. They have restored those numbers with all the people who lost somebody, who are angry, who want revenge and wants to unleash that fury on innocent Israelis. But could you imagine replacing an investment of that kind, another Riviera, in the midst of that? That's stupid. So no, the only way they have to make that investment possible is displacing the population. So, some may say, well, but they are when the Abraham Accords were signed in 2020, Saudi Arabia and other three Arab countries turned their back on Palestine. Yes, but it didn't happen with a Nakba happening in the background with the destruction of Gaza and 47,000 people dead in the background. So it's even for Saudi Arabia, it would be extremely difficult to sell that to their Wahhabi religious backers. The ideological backers that declare that the Saudi kingdom is a legitimate kingdom at the light of Islam. So, will be the Saudi prince willing to take that risk? I don't think so. And the threats to Jordan and Egypt to not be part of this insane plan of taking the Palestinians, Trump wants to displace, doesn't help. It would just add instability as it has added instability to Jordan. That brings us to the question, what Democrats can do. Well, they have to, again, like in Ukraine, they have to repudiate Biden's management of the conflict. He could have acted as an international force model in the Olmert plan. He missed that target. He could have back Galan and try to get 5 to 8 seats in the Knesset to force early elections and destabilizing Netanyahu's government, so he could get a more reliable partner, either Gantz or Galant, depending on how the Israeli public opinion were going. But you would have had a real ceasefire, not this mirage. And in the worst case, basically that, because if you try the third option, that is using the arms sent to Israel as leverage, you were already too late. But he could have done either of the two first options. He could have embraced one of the two first options, and instead Biden decided to turn a cold shoulder to Gantz and Gallant and Olmert and turn Netanyahu into Julius Caesar. And we know we see again Trump building on the disastrous Biden's foreign policy. So Democrats trying to win at least the narrative, which is what you are not doing because you say you have no leverage, that you are helpless, that if you voter have any complaint, you have to call the Republicans as if they were your representatives. Now, let's go to the Jason Furman article. Jason Furman claims, I wanted to mention this because it's important. Jason Furman sustains that it was the origin of the inflation that doomed the Biden administration was the excessive stimulus in the American Relief Act. This is comes in opposition to Paul Krugman's position, which I share, that the origin was the supply chain clogging that started with the torpid, clumsy reaction of the Chinese government to the pandemic. So let's start by understanding that how the inflation works. It's true that the supply chain crisis was the origin of this inflation, but let's admit that spending was the fuel. So how inflation works? It starts with the supply chain in goods import. Then, if this had been a shock, so once one time increase in prices, probably it would have been absorbed. But let's remember, what is the definition of inflation? Inflation is a sustained and unequal increase in prices in the economy. If it were sustained but predictable, well, would be just an accounting problem. Everybody would increase 1% or 2% or 3%, and you could adjust salaries and goods and services in that magnitude, and it would be a nuisance, an accountable nuisance, but that's all. But the problem is that it's not uniform, it's not predictable. And if it's sustained, if it goes beyond a one-time shock, those in the economy who have more bargaining power, let's say in the case of workers, those who are unionized, in the case of goods and services, those corporations that have pricing power, those are going to displace the increase of costs to others. This in time is going to reignite the process. And if it's not absorbed by the most vulnerable, or if new shocks come, as it happened in the supply chain crisis, it's going to be pushed to the cost of goods and services, which in turn is going to be used, it will be reacted by those with more bargaining power, unionized workers, and corporations with pricing power to increase their prices and display and push the cost of inflation to the most vulnerable. That's and then you see this snowball rolling down, and what the Federal Reserve does. Well, however it has origin, they will increase interest rates with the interest rate or quantitative tightening, and suppress demand, because with suppressed demand, whoever is the culprit of this the inflation, the matter of the fact is that inflation is going to end. It's not. It's fair. It's not fair, of course, because it punishes especially those who are most vulnerable, as if where they were had not been punished enough by the inflation. But that's how inflation is stopped if you leave it up to the Federal Reserve. It's their job. So now that we have understand how inflation works, uh, let me address one excuse. It affected other countries too. Yes, it affected other countries too. But in the case of the United States, even though the USA waged better than other European countries, they had tools that Biden didn't use because he was too timid. Instead of increasing the hours of operation of the Los Angeles port while the rest of the supply chain was still working at normal hours, which turned it useless, he could have used the president of the Civilian Conservation Corps to try to unclog the problem in the container problem and the driver's problem in the supply chain. He could have appealed to the Army Corps of Engineers. Roosevelt did that, and he dismissed any idiotic objection that the Civilian Conservation Corps was militarizing the society. It works. It works and it helps. It could have solved the whole problem. No, it could have not easily at least a couple of points of inflation. Yes, and yes, the Federal Reserve could have acted sooner. Granted, but still, the origin, if especially if you take into account the effect in other countries that they were equally affected by the problem, the supply chain crisis, those validate Krugman's proposition that the origin was the supply chain and not the spending that came from the American Relief Act. And yet, I could make one concession. I wrote about that in all emails in all the tweets I wrote in those times, that the concern of the Biden administration was that Delta could reignite the economic effects of the pandemic, and that was correct. So they couldn't risk doing what Obama did, that he asked 800 billion, and when he wanted to ask for more, Republicans said no. So on that they were correct. But if you use that money to send checks, if you promise to, if you when you ask that money, you say that that money is to send checks to consumers, you have to send the checks. You cannot dose the checks depending on how the pandemic evolves. And Delta proved to be much less harmful to the economy than the original COVID. So that this new wave of this new wave of relief should have been used for infrastructure, because in this case you could dosify, you could dose the rhythm of the inflow of money you were sending to the economy. So if Delta proved to be as harmful as COVID, you could push more of those of that money to shovel to highways and shovel already projects that implies that you are going to send that money right away to the economy, or if not, you could use if as it happened, Delta didn't prove to be as harmful to the economy, you could have used that money to send it over time with trying to not push on prices that much. So you could have dosed it more slowly. Unfortunately, nobody read my tweets those days, and as nobody reads them now, but at least I said so. I can say that. Now, both Furman and Krugman neglect one very important point, though, that is not seen in the movement of the PCE or CPI inflation. PCE and CPI are the indicators used by the Federal Reserve. PCE is the Fed favorite indicator. But take into account the effect of uncertainty, especially as you can see in the graphics, on the expectation on income and the expectations of on inflation itself. You could see those brusque ups and downs of the PCA services inflation, compare those to the effects previous to 2020. These brusque ups and downs are not that marked. But after the pandemic, when Biden comes to government, the ups and downs are very brusque. What that means? Those are variations. That means that if you are a head of household or a member of the working class, you could not you could not foresee what's going to happen next month. Would you be able to make ends meet? You didn't know, and that takes a huge toll. And that takes a huge toll, especially when interest rates are so huge, and you don't want to get in debt. But you have no idea because the variations are too high. You cannot estimate them. That's uncertainty. So that, and as we will see, that had a huge correlation with the vote when you see the demographics by income. Now, the effect on wages. The effect on wages as Furman says, affected especially the lower middle class. Those because many of these were made estimation were made with a typical consumer. I have heard of who made about $80,000. Then I have read another estimation assuming a typical consumer of $62,000. The matter of the fact is that the typical consumer was making much less. So here comes the second article, an article I learned about from Politico, in which the Ludwig Institute shows that the they take the amount of the median wage of about $62,000, and they sustain that when you consider all the people who are trying to make a living, and not just those who come into the definition of median wage, the actual median wage is about $52,300, and that brings at another point. If that is so, the effect of inflation is very difficult because the basket of products and the goods and services consumed by a family that makes $80,000 is a bit different from the one consumed by a family who makes about $50,000. Let me read you just a paragraph of that article. It says, the effect, of course, was particularly intense in the wake of the pandemic. In 2023 alone, the CPA indicated that inflation had driven prices up by 4.1%. But the true cost of living, as measured by our research, rose more than twice as much, a full 9.4%. Purchasing power fall at the median by 4.3% in 2023. This clearly contradicts the, the conclusions if you take into account a family making $62,000 or $80,000 that have another a different, not just purchasing power, but a different basket of products. Not everybody consumes the same. If you are making 50,000, you spend more on rent, on food, on energy, and less on entertainment, for instance. And not to mention another other cases. Like, for instance, if you do have no attachment, something I mentioned in my video about clueless Democrats, you could chase job offers state by state, but if you have attachments like two kids and a wife, that's not that easy. Add to that the effects of tax benefits that were never adjusted to inflation, could mean that those benefits inflation had a negative effect on those benefits because the amount you got for child tax credit in 2021 in 2024 were much less than the amount adjusted by inflation. What you could buy with that child tax credit was much less than you could buy with that same tax credit in 2021. Consider that those who had the misfortune of having a medical emergency uh, uh, or another important house or car repair and had to go into their savings, found that their pandemic savings were gone, and many got into credit card debt that has gone to historic hikes. Not to mention that this interest rate refinancing that credit card debt very difficult, very expensive, and access into a mortgage very even more difficult. So if we see when we compare what happened with those making less than $50,000 and those who were making between 50 and 100K, it makes sense. The vote, the demographics of the votes in the election in the last elections. It's very it should not surprise us. Then finally, let's address a couple of paragraphs from the Furman's article about infrastructure and renewables. I believe Paul Krugman has made a good case about how we are obsessed with manufacturing, which is 8.6% of the labor force, and how fruitless are doomed to be the efforts to revive those manufacturing jobs when we could create good uh, service jobs around green products, like in the case of winterization, and other activities that thrived when we found that we could, instead of producing the solar panels, we could buy them much cheaper, which made them more affordable by more houses, and which so made gave those people who were in the winterization business more clients. Biden's policies help one sectors in manufacturing and hurt others. But the general trend in manufacturing was doomed to begin with, especially when automation has killed, even in the best case, the chances of getting more jobs in that sector. But where I agree, and I have agreed for a long time, as you can see in my tweets, is where I agree with Furman is that permitting and inflation have killed lots of projects on renewables. Even even on renewables, that was a sector that was supposedly favored by the Biden administration, and there is you must probably, if you follow this kind of news, the new, you might have learned the case of renewable projects that were closing their doors because they could not keep funding their projects. And there you have to understand something, is that inflation kept rising their costs and permitting the status quo in permitting kept condemned them to not see any income in many years. So you say, well, then there is something you have to do. You have to reform permitting, and of course, there is even a Brookings Institute proposal trying to consolidate permitting in the in the at the federal level to try to avoid this bottleneck that was because the Biden administration focused on demand but not on supply, and therefore created a bottleneck for the same projects they wanted to promote. So you would say, well, that would be unpopular in some cases, but if you did it early enough, you could provide results, and so you could turn a liability into an asset. Yes. Well, according to Furman, I don't know, but I would not be surprised. The permitting reform was opposed by the far left because in their naive vision of life, what we had to do is to reduce consumption. They live in a world where the war of Ukraine and the imperial aspirations of Putin never happened, where China is not the second economy. But the matter is that whatever the reason, the Biden administration didn't move to the Biden administration move, yes, take a few steps to ease the process, but it were as timid, as shy, and as ineffective as their steps to solve the supply chain crisis. Time was unforgiving with this project, and he ended up hurting the same projects he wants to, to favor. And this is particularly tragic because now is going to be used by fossil fuel lobbyists as an excuse to object to other projects in the same kind. And it's particularly tragic not just because of climate change, which is an unforgiving reality that is going to hurt the most vulnerable the most, but also because it could have given an excellent opportunity to show that the government can make direct investment. Just like in the case of Roosevelt with the Tennessee Valley Authority. And if you read about this experience in the Hilsick book, Michael Hilsick, you will see how not just it improve the access to electricity, allow to restore, conserve soils and other benefits in the area, but also gave FDR an opportunity to show that direct investment can work, and it did work. The second thing I have to regret is that this would have allowed FDR take a lesson from, excuse me, this would allow Biden to take a lesson from Kennedy in his space race and invest and direct more funding to investment to research and development in the case of, for instance, sequestration and fusion. Because let's be honest, we are not going to reduce the risk of climate change by reducing consumption. The only way we can do it, the only way we can ameliorate the impact is by increasing research in sequestration and fusion. Because, but not just, let's not do it the stupid way we have done so far as credits, because we have an obsession with credits. Learn, don't be that stupid if you are a Democrat, and learn from the TVA what direct investment, and they use the power of government to regulate. If you have to invest in sequestration and fusion and use the power of government to regulate, but you cannot do that if you are timid, if you are shy, if you are always trying to look like a light Republican. So that brings us to the conclusion. The Biden administration tried to be, as they consider themselves, post-neoliberal. But by being post-neoliberal, they meant trying to be New Dealers. And I supported that. And I have tweets supporting that when Biden was still trying to emulate FDR. The problem is that, as in the case of permitting, as in the case of immigration, and as in other cases, they try to get a marriage between FDR and the new left, the identitarian left, the cool left. And what they got instead were demons. That was as if they were trying to anoint the new pope with the blessing of Marilyn Manson. So, no surprise, in the case of renewables, they supported the stimulus to demand by block block any real initiative to reform permitting. In the case of immigration, they adopted a childish no detentions nonsense that created the mayhem at the border and destroyed the positive trend of attitudes in favor of immigration that has been positive until 2020. And that's something you have to decide now. You cannot marry FDR with the postmodern, or whatever they want to call themselves, left. That's the left that irritates the working class. That's the kind of left that makes the working class blood boil, especially when you Democrats have not delivered. And you can take that and this is nothing new. Thomas Frank got a pretty nice portrait of how that happened in Kansas. You have to reject the new identitarian, ridiculous left. You have to, so you cannot be like King Martin, who apparently tries to conciliate both, because not realizing that to gain this woke left, you are losing the working class. And what's worse, you are not even protecting the minorities that the woke left is claiming they protect, because transsexual people need investment protections, labor protections against bully, investment in mental health. They don't need to be that transgender athletes beat women in women's sports, or talking, or be asked their pronouns. That's idiotic. Hispanics don't, among the Hispanic priorities is not to be called Latinx. As in the black priorities is not the case of blackface, it's actually education and the economy. So you cannot, you have to be brave enough to say enough is enough, and and expel the identitarian left to the fringe where it belongs. Otherwise, you will get this kind of marriage. This because if something the Biden administration have proven is that this marriage is not going to work. That you are not going to anoint the same the next FDR with the blessing of the identitarian left. That would be, as I said, as trying to appoint the next pope with the blessing of Marilyn Manson. And that's something that is not going to come, unfortunately, from the Democratic Party. It has to be the people, the organized people, who make that demand. Otherwise, you would be just condemned to what we know, which is after at the primaries, see some establishment guy imposed on you, and then before election day being told that it's either that or Trump, and Trump is bad, so you have to vote for the establishment guy. The problem is that the working class is not buying that anymore, and they are continually moving in the background to the right, as they started moving in the case of Kansas to the right. And unless you act sooner, unless you act right now, you may end up in a situation with those cultural attitudes calcify, and by then it's going to be too late. So, having said that, I leave you with our newscast.
Good evening. This is Brian Thomas Simons, and these are the main headlines of this hour. Among other news,
this morning President Trump signed a new executive order creating a task force to combat anti-Christian biases. The task force will be led by Vivek Ramaswamy as a consolation prize after he was kicked out of Doge by Elon Musk. Among its first assignments, the task force will make sure that 1. Interracial marriage will be again unlawful in the 51 states, including Canada, and territories for those with income under $100,000, since the Heritage Foundation has identified interracial marriage as a preemptive trick to avoid U.S. immigration laws. For those making at least $100,000, the legal presumption won't apply as long as they acquire at least that amount in President Trump's meme coins. Justice Clarence Thomas will be exempted from the above-mentioned executive order. 2. Local police should assist patriotic groups like the KKK, the Oath Keepers, and the Proud Boys whenever they rally, as long as they sing at least once the hymn "When the Saints Go Marching In." The aforementioned assistance will include providing them with refreshments, stopping traffic, and beating counter-demonstrators. 3. Ustase Day will be included among Christian holidays to commemorate their vehement, though a little rude, ways of converting stubborn Yugoslavs to the true faith, and their conversion into friars when, after the fall of Nazism and accepting God's will, they escaped Allies' persecution with the help of Pope Pius XII. 4. Gay and transsexual rights will be respected only for those who accept to go through the lapidation test. If God in His divine wisdom resuscitates them after they have exhaled their last breath, that will be taken as a sign that that person has been exempted from the executive order. Those with income above $100,000 who buy at least that amount in President Trump's meme coins will be equally exempted from the executive order. 5. February 14th will be, from now on, known as Jesus' Day of Fury against illegal aliens. To celebrate that day, Americans will be entitled to assault anybody who looks like an illegal alien, make civil arrests to surrender them to ICE, and commemorate the parable of the Good Samaritan as it was actually intended by the Founding Fathers. 6. Tax Day will be replaced by Jesus Day to commemorate the day Jesus expelled the money changers from the temple to advocate for tax cuts and oppose big government. The first proclamation made in Jesus Day will demand the firing of IRS auditors who examine tax returns from corporations and individuals making more than $100,000. 7. Religious education will be once again mandatory in elementary school. The curriculum will be modeled on the teachings of former preacher Jerry Falwell and will include a prayer day and a snake handling day to honor the servants of God who lost their lives bitten by their own snakes. The subject will include practical sessions in which the students will be able to get acquainted with the Christian practice of handling snakes. 8. Every home in the 51 states, including Canada, and territories will set up a nativity scene on December 24th, which will stay in place until the end of December 25th, to commemorate the birth of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. The new Jesus figurine that will meet the standards set in the executive order will be available at trumpstore.com starting October 1st. B. Singer Selena Gomez will upload a new video in which she cries for deported immigrants after learning that many among the deported to Colombia were not guilty of anything but immigration violations, and that the air flight included even children and pregnant women. C. Ken Martin, new DNC chair, has announced the 3 pillars of his strategy to beat Republicans in the next midterms and during the congressional struggles that will take place in the current Congress. 1. In each speech, he will repeat the phrase working class 5 times but will not offer them anything specific. If it worked in Candyman, why should it not work here? Asked Mr. Martin rhetorically. 2. He will admonish working-class Democrats to ask one another their pronouns in the same tone used by Obama to admonish black people to vote for Kamala Harris. If it worked for Obama, why can't it work for me? Asked the new chair rhetorically. 3. Because in their own admission, Democratic leaders have no leverage in Congress. Those who voted for Democrats and are unsatisfied with the way Trump is running the country will have to direct their calls to Republican members of Congress. We'll be helpless until voters decide Trump is not cool and vote for us just because we are not him. But routing our voters to Republicans will teach our friends on the other side of the aisle how our supporters feel, declared Chair Martin.
This has been the news of this hour. Sponsored by Church of the Holy Redeemer's Power in the Spirit. Have you accepted Jesus Christ as your personal Savior? Did you vote for Trump in 2016 and then in 2020? This is the right church for you. If so, Church of the Holy Redeemer's Power in the Spirit is the only Christian church that can promise you in the Lord to have 72 virgins in heaven for only a donation of $50 a month. You will have access to those 72 virgins in heaven. For an additional $25, you will be allowed to replace 10 of them, and for $100, Heaven Premium, you will be allowed to choose them for yourself. Guaranteed, if you're not satisfied with those 72 virgins after you die, full refund of your money. We accept Visa, MasterCard, American Express, and Discover.